Welcome to Up Close, the research, opinion and analysis podcast from the University of Melbourne, Australia.
I'm Jennifer Cook. Thanks for joining us. On this episode of Up Close, we challenge the conventional wisdom that businesses should do all they can to retain their valuable employees, that to lose talent is to lose profits. Indeed, today's guest has declared the war for talent is over, and talent has won. Ian Williamson is Professor of Human Resource Management and Helen McPherson Smith Chair of Leadership for Social Impact at the Melbourne Business School. And he says it's time organisations did a complete rethink on what it means to keep talent, especially in light of increasing evidence that many young people are changing employers each year. Indeed, he says many industries are facing the problem not of getting work, but finding the right people to do that work. He points to the Indian IT provider HCL Technologies as an example of an organisation that has adopted the radical philosophy of putting the employee first and the customer second, based on the belief that great employees have become scarcer than customers. Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Ian, that sounds like heresy. It's a huge fundamental philosophical shift for business.
I think it is. I think it's an appreciation of where the value is actually being generated in firms. And for so long, we've thought about value being created by factories or machinery or brands or these various other types of attributes of the organization. Yet, I think we've entered into an era, maybe it's the information era, where it's what people know. It's in between our ears that is actually driving all the value for firms. And that changes the nature of the game in terms of how firms think about employees. And also, I think the level of power that employees actually have, particularly knowledge workers, as it pertains to the relationship they have with an employer.
And let's look at it from the point of view of the employee. What's happened globally and culturally that makes it easier for us to move from organisations?
So on one hand, you have this shift to a service-based economy, which really makes it about the unique relationship I have with individuals. Simultaneously, one thing we know about services or the types of skills that knowledge workers can provide, engineers, IT executives, or lawyers, these are generalizable skills. They're transportable. If I think about myself as an academic, I used to work in the United States at a university there, and I moved to Australia on the other side of the planet. And within a week, I had the same level of productivity that I had in the United States because the skill set was transportable. It's a professional skill. And I think what you're seeing is the barriers of movement have reduced. So globalization, trade agreements, information technology, it's much easier for people to relocate to different situations, different geographical locations. There's a lot of opportunity, and it seems very hard for me to believe that people will give up that mobility. In fact, all the statistics that I've seen around the world suggest that employee mobility is increasing, not decreasing. And in some cases, if I think of China, for example, the numbers are suggesting that the average tenure for a Chinese employee between the ages of, say, 25 and 35 is 1 to 2 years.
That is a stunning figure.
Yeah, if you think about how long it took you to figure out, how to do your job, work with your employer, you probably didn't figure that out in a year. And maybe by 2 years, you kind of figured out what you needed to do, and then you're leaving.
You're being very generous to me. Thank you. Thank you, Ian. But look, let's look at this bottom line fiscal reality that losing employees, doesn't it cost money? I mean, the increased admin expenses alone, they estimate it costing 100% to 1.5 times the salary of an employee with high skills. So how do we readjust that thinking?
Well, clearly there's an administrative motive to reduce turnover. And the numbers are definitely correct. 100 to 150% of annual salary is what it takes to replace a skilled professional. And that number can jump dramatically if we're talking about a highly skilled individual. So if I was trying to replace, say, a geologist in Australia, which, we have a large mining business here, that number can easily be 200 to 250% of annual salary. That typically draws a lot of attention and is why many organizations strive to reduce the turnover rates of their staff. However, my perspective on this is that actually undersells the value of people. In fact, the more valuable component of this is the human capital, the knowledge that a person possesses. So when you lose someone, you lose that knowledge. And if that knowledge goes to a competitor, that's the double whammy, right? Not only do you not have it, but now the person who's competing against you has it, and they're going to use it against you. in some situations. The other component that we oftentimes don't think about is that people bring with them, in addition to a depository of knowledge, they're also a depository of relationships. And their relationships have a very important component, both in terms of how things get done in organizations, but also the way in which we develop business relationships with clients or suppliers. You have those individuals in your organization that you trust, that you go to get information, that you trust to sort of handle things when you're not there. Imagine what your day looks like if they're no longer there. A lot more difficult. And then also think about your best client relationships. Think about the best salespeople that you have. What distinguishes these individuals is both what they know about your products, but also they have a relationship that transcends the organization with their clients. What happens if they leave? And so I think while we can focus on the administrative component, in fact, the greatest value that people generate for organizations is the human capital, the knowledge, and also the social capital, the relationships.
You're listening to Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm Jennifer Cook, and we're talking about the war for talent in knowledge industries, and we're joined by Ian Williamson. Now, Ian, as you were speaking then, I couldn't help thinking how some organisations view employees, and when they win someone over to their company, they see them as trophies, holding them up as we've got this person. Even the terminology we use, I was headhunted. Very competitive, which frames it as a win-lose situation, doesn't it?
It certainly does. If you go back in 2001, there was a very famous book that was published by a former McKinsey consultant called The War for Talent. And it really framed this as a win-lose type of situation in the sense that if I can attract your best person, I get them, you don't have them, and there's this sort of net-sum zero game going on. And I think that has really shaped our thinking over the last decade about what it means to win, to be in this talent game, and that you win or you lose. I would think going forward, given the changes that we see in the broader economy around being more service-based, given the changes that we see in terms of the preferences of employees, that they have no expectation of being with organizations for 10, 15 years, perhaps not even 2 years, that war mentality, that win-lose mentality is probably not going to serve us well, that we probably need to rethink this. My perspective on this is not about whether or not you win or lose in terms of getting a person or losing a person. Going forward in this information age, it's about, do you have access to talent? And this is about, do you have relationship with talent? And that could be that you have a relationship with people who have skills during the recruitment process. You can have a relationship with a highly skilled employee, a person that may be an employee. Or you can have a relationship with someone who's a former employee, and that still gives you access to the most important component, the human capital perhaps, and even more important, the social capital.
If we go back just one generation, or certainly 2 generations ago, where it was a mindset or an expectation that you would get the job and you would stay and invest your loyalty with that employer until retirement, and there are still people doing that today. It strikes me that involves putting a lot of faith in a company and in an organisation. So what you're saying is now people are putting the faith in their own skills.
Well, I think organizations have done a good job of training people to think this way. We've, gone through the global financial crisis, and it's interesting when people say that's the greatest financial crisis of our lifetime. Of course, I can remember very vividly in 2001, 2002 in the United States, everyone thought the dot-com crash was the greatest financial crisis of our lifetime, and perhaps in 10 years we'll be having the same conversation. And during this whole process, what did you see? You saw organizations laying off individuals in an effort to save costs. And out of these crises, what organizations say is, we're not going to guarantee your job. We're going to guarantee that you're employable so that you're able to get a job. Now, if you're a somewhat intelligent individual and you're a knowledge worker, you begin to realize that the thing that makes you most attractive is the breadth of skills that you have. So the more I see, the more I can do. So why would I limit myself to only working with one organization when I know if I can work with 2 or 3 organizations over the course of my career, this actually makes me more valuable. I've seen more. I can do more. I've often said, the war for talent is over talent won, because I think people appreciate that the breadth of knowledge that they have, the breadth of exposure really increases their value. And so they have a big incentive to work with different organizations, to work in different settings, because it makes them more valuable to employers.
Why haven't we thought about talent in terms of these relationships before? Why does this seem to be a new and radical way of thinking?
Well, we're oftentimes trapped by the terminology that we use to think about things. And In many cases, or at least historically, we've thought about people when they leave an organization to go work for someone, that they're a traitor, that they've turned their back on us, that person's name that we no longer speak around here. And this is the notion of this win or lose. Yet what we know from practice is that people leave and go work with organizations, and they maintain relationships and friends with their former colleagues. And perhaps that's not a bad thing at all. And maybe that's something we should celebrate. And I would even go a step further in the research that I've been doing to say it's something that firms need to be strategic about and actually utilize as a mechanism to actually drive value for their firms.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because what you're saying is there really shouldn't be a war at all.
No, I don't think that's good terminology at all.
On Up Close this episode, we're speaking about the war for talent with Ian Williamson. I'm Jennifer Cook. Now, Ian, this war for talent, is it more relevant in knowledge industries?
I definitely think so. This is where you see the great scarcity of talent around the world. The reality is there are just not as many highly skilled individuals for the number of jobs in those professions. I was looking at some recent statistics in India, which is, a very large provider of information technology outsourcing services. You have several very well-known, highly regarded companies in India that provide this. And there was some research done by an organization there stating that the biggest threat to that business for that country was the lack of people that they were going to be able to produce to hire to fill the jobs. So the big concern was that they would actually be able to go out and get the business, but would not have enough individuals to actually fill the positions to provide the service. And we're looking at numbers around 500,000 people shortage. These are huge numbers. And so whether I'm doing work here in Australia or doing with work in companies in South America or Asia or United States, one thing that's very common is that everyone is saying that the highly skilled individuals, where can I find them? There's a shortage of them. How can I keep them? So again, I think this shifts the power towards the employee.
Could you tell us what happened at the investment banking firm Goldman Sachs in 2004, that when several high-performing traders, they left to start their own multi-billion-dollar hedge fund?
Well, this is an interesting story, and it kind of, I think, goes to this issue of not using war as the appropriate terminology, that there's not necessarily a winner or a loser. So in this situation, you had several high-profile employees in Goldman Sachs, which is obviously a well-known investment bank, leave to go start their own enterprises. And there was a lot of coverage in this stating, wow, this is going to be very detrimental to Goldman Sachs. How are they going to replace this talent? Is this perhaps the beginning of the end of Goldman Sachs? Now, what happens in this situation is interesting. These individuals go off, they start their own funds. They later become clients, I should add, very profitable clients for Goldman Sachs. And one of the reasons why they choose Goldman Sachs as a provider is that they had good relationships with people there. And when I read this for the first time, I thought to myself, well, did Goldman Sachs win or lose here? On one hand, they lost these individuals, and they obviously carried with them tremendous amount of skill sets. So they lost this human capital. But on the other hand, they gained very profitable clients and had an advantage over other organizations at getting those clients because they had these relationships. So I think this speaks to this idea that sometimes you might lose the person, and perhaps you lose access to their knowledge. But if you're wise, you maintain the relationship, and that the relationship actually carries tremendous amounts of value for them, both in the short term and, in this case, in the long term as well.
So you're saying we need to drop this language, this battle language, that it is a war, and you're suggesting a third approach, aren't you? Relational.
Right. So when you talk to many executives about their perspectives on talent, they typically come up with two ideas. The first thing is, we definitely want to keep the people that are really good. And I think of this as a defensive routine. So in essence, I'm going to try to defend against all these other organizations that want to come out and attack and take my talent from me. And the way we defend on this is that we try to create these great workplaces that are very engaging. We pay people well. We try to train our managers to understand how to create environments that are exciting and supportive. And hopefully by making an environment that's attractive, people will have less of a motivation to leave. And I think that's a great thing. And I spend a lot of time with companies talking about that. Another approach that you see is organizations get very mad. So despite this great environment, a person still leaves. So there you see strategies such as a retaliatory approach. And here is where organizations will try to fight to perhaps force non-compete clauses. And they'll put people on garden leave, or they'll make it very difficult for them to find other jobs, or they'll perhaps not provide them with recommendations to other employers. What they're trying to do is they're trying to increase the cost of leaving. So people will go, well, I would leave, but if I leave, I perhaps might get maybe a litigation against me around working for a competitor. And so this makes it, in their mind, makes it perhaps less likely that an individual will leave. Not much evidence to suggest that actually works. I think in many cases when organizations go down that path, it's really more of an emotional response, sort of thinking of a person as a traitor than it is anything else. And if it has any value, perhaps what it might do is it gives you a certain amount of buffer time. Maybe you get 4 or 5 months where you can launch a product before the competitor can. But eventually, you're going to lose that human capital, and your competitor is going to get everything you lost. Now, I've been doing some work with a colleague of mine in the United States, Dr. Deepak Samoya, who's at the University of Illinois. And based on our research, we suggest that organizations adopt a third approach. And this is really a relational approach. And this is embracing the fact that people leave. No matter how good of retention strategy you might have, you're still going to have top individuals leave. And that this is a fact of life, and everything we've seen suggests it's going to increase. So instead of hiding and trying to fight against that, embrace it and appreciate that the reasons why people leave are not always negative. It could be that they want an opportunity that you can't provide. It could be because of family situations, they need to move to a different location. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to have a relationship with you anymore. And in fact, them going to work for another organization, perhaps instead of a competitor, what we frame as a cooperator, this might be a supplier, a vendor, a potential client, an existing client, that this relationship that you have with them can carry tremendous amounts of value if you think about using it wisely. So we focus on how organizations can use things like alumni programs, a concept that's clearly well understood at the universities and have very aggressive and very sophisticated ways of thinking about engaging with alums. Oftentimes we find is that companies have no thought process around this. Yet you have these large organizations that generate thousands of alums around the world who actually enjoyed working there. And why not develop a relationship with them?
Have you got some examples of those companies?
Well, I think there's a wide variety of examples in different industries that have done this quite effectively. One that stands out to me is really leading this is McKinsey, the consulting firm. If you go to their website, what you'll find is they have a whole section of their website dedicated to alums. In this website, they highlight the achievements of their alums. They provide information on cutting-edge research that they're doing. They invite them to events to bring them back to talk about different issues. One might say, why would a company invest money and time to deal with people that no longer work for them? Well, you have to think about what their business is. McKinsey sells consulting services. The economists might call this a credence good, right? A good whose value that you cannot ascertain until after you've consumed it. It's not like you can go kick the tires, drive it around, take it for a test drive. When you hire a McKinsey consultant, you don't know if they're any good until after they've delivered the service, typically after you've paid them. So how do you make a decision as to whether or not you want to hire a particular consultant or a lawyer or an accountant? These are all things that if you're not in that area, how do you evaluate them? Well, typically, we go and we ask a friend. Have you ever had a lawyer before? Who'd you use? Did you like that person? And we use that as a referral, right? And we're very comfortable doing it. Why? Is it the case that your friend is a lawyer? No. It's because you trust the relationship. That's the social capital. So what McKinsey, I think, and others are realizing is that when individuals are dealing with a consumption decision, they really are dealing with this uncertainty, particularly if it's a highly skilled situation. How do I reduce that uncertainty? I rely on relationship because the relationship conveys trust and it conveys reciprocation so that you're not going to take advantage of me because we are in relationship. So a McKinsey person leaves for whatever reason. They go to work for a company. That company needs consulting services. The employee says, I used to work at McKinsey and those guys are pretty good. We should give them a call. And they go, well, okay, if you know them, we'll trust them. Why not give them a try? And thus they're able to get business. So this is where I think they are very savvy in appreciating that not all turnover is always bad. That if a person leaves to go to a potential client, that's probably going to increase the opportunity that you have to get business from that client in the future.
You're listening to Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm Jennifer Cook, and we're talking about the war for talent in knowledge industries, and we're joined by Ian Williamson. So, Ian, when we look at this 250% replacement cost when an employee leaves an organisation, how do information systems such as client relationship management and other technology-based approaches deal with this?
Well, I think organizations obviously are savvy in that they are trying to figure out ways to deal with the loss of the individual. So maybe if I'm concerned about losing the human capital, the knowledge of a person, I might want to have an information technology system that allows me to capture what they know. And you have various organizations that try to incentivize and encourage employees to put the information in databases, share employee contacts, write down details on particular client relationships. And the idea being that if that person did leave, the company still possesses the knowledge that they could use to engage with that client.
I can see the flaw there. You're basically asking someone to hand over their contact book. They're not going to do that.
Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that individuals do not provide the information, that they are not very active in filling in these databases. There are things you can do to increase their willingness, but again, you have to appreciate the distinction between human capital and social capital. So human capital is the knowledge, and that represents perhaps the potential for you to engage in activity. But social capital is the opportunity to actually realize that potential. So knowledge without relationship typically doesn't create economic exchange. In fact, people will engage in relationship or exchange with individuals based on a relationship, even if they're perceiving them as incompetent. Right? So I may not perceive you as a vendor as really being capable of doing something, but I trust you, so I will work with you to actually upskill you to provide the services that I need. Versus I know that you're capable of doing something, but I don't trust you. Right? And so I don't trust what you're going to do with my intellectual property. Perhaps you might share this intellectual property with my competitors who you also have as a client. Perhaps you might try to compete with me or against me with my own material. So the ideal situation is that I have partnerships with individuals who are highly skilled and I have high levels of trust. But if you look at behavior, we typically focus on trust over skill.
So, Ian, if we look at this idea that you could have a lifetime employment and oppose that with this now view that, you're guaranteed to be employable, you need to have a skill set. Could you put this in the context of a country, say, like Japan, and what that means there?
Obviously, Japan is well known for many of the large organizations having lifetime employment opportunities. And this is also true in many other countries with other companies. But again, it changes the whole perspective as what is the role of management. If I have an employee that's been with me for 20 years and they have seen my system in and out, many organizations will say, well, we can't afford to keep them anymore. They make too much money for what they provide. So we're going to remove them from the organization and perhaps we can replace them with lower skilled or perhaps cheaper labor. And this is, again, focusing on this administrative component as to how people add value. I would say that organizations that adopt that type of philosophy, the successful ones, what they look at and they say, wow, how lucky am I? I have a person that's 20 years of human capital. They've developed 20 years of relationships. So the question is not how can I pay them less? How can I reduce my administrative costs? The question is how can I generate greater value, greater return from this human capital and this social capital? And this is, I think, fundamentally where you see managers who are taking a perspective on people in two different ways. You have one set of managers that looks at people and they fundamentally think of people in terms of expense. And it makes sense because, at business schools, we teach people to use financial statements. And on financial statements, labor is typically treated as an expense. Interestingly enough, buildings are treated as assets. And so when you ask a manager, what do you do with an expense? You reduce an expense. What do you do with an asset? You generate a return from an asset. And does it matter how much an asset costs? No. It's about what the return can generate. So if I had to spend $1,000 and get a 10% return or $10,000 and get a 10% return, what would I do? I spend $10,000 because I'll get a greater return. And this is the way we need to think about people, right? So if I'm going to have a workforce that's been there for a long period of time, I have a tremendous human capital, an asset. I have tremendous relationships. They know people within the organization and outside of the organization. The managerial challenge here is not how can I reduce my expenses. It's how can I generate a higher level return for this wonderful asset that I have. This is, I think, the thing that differentiates the successful and the unsuccessful organizations.
Ian, thank you so much for your time today and for showing us that there shouldn't have even been a war at all in the first place.
My pleasure, Jennifer.
That was Ian Williamson, Professor of Human Resource Management and Helen McPherson Smith Chair of Leadership for Social Impact at the Melbourne Business School. And he's been speaking with us about the war for talent in knowledge industries. Relevant links, a full transcript and more info on this episode can be found at our website at upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Up Close is a production of the University of Melbourne, Australia. This episode was recorded on the 18th of August 2011 and our producers were Calvin Parham and Eric Van Bemmel. Audio engineering by Gavin Neighbour. Up Close is created by Eric Van Bemmel and Calvin Parham. I'm Jennifer Cook. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to Up Close. For more information, visit upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Copyright 2011, the University of Melbourne.